The winter of 1939 descended upon Finland like a frozen curse. Temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze fuel in tanks, shatter steel, and turn exhaled breath into instant ice crystals. In this merciless landscape, where visibility stretched for miles across endless white plains, one man would become the Soviet Army's worst nightmare. His name was Simo Häyhä. He stood just 152 centimeters tall, barely 5 feet. A simple farmer from the rural municipality of Rautjärvi, he had never sought glory or fame. Yet in the span of 100 days, this unassuming man would achieve what seemed impossible. 505 confirmed kills. No scope, no advanced technology. Just iron sights, supernatural patience, and an intimate knowledge of the winter that had shaped his entire life. The Soviets would come to call him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. Chapter 1. When Giants Invaded. The 30th of November, 1939. The date, Finland's innocence, died. Without warning, without declaration of war, Soviet bombers appeared in the skies above Helsinki. 500,000 Soviet soldiers, a force so massive it defied comprehension, crashed across Finland's borders. Stalin wanted Finland. He wanted its strategic territory, and he believed he could take it in weeks. The odds were apocalyptic. The Soviet Union had 160 million people. Finland had less than 4 million. The Red Army brought thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, and seemingly infinite soldiers. Finland had determination, knowledge of their homeland, and men like Simo Häyhä. Simo was 33 years old when the call came. He'd spent his entire life in the forests of Karelia, hunting elk and moose in conditions that would kill unprepared men within hours. He knew these woods like the lines on his calloused palms. Every tree, every depression in the snow, every shadow that could hide a man. He reported to his unit, the 6th Company of the 34th Infantry Regiment, carrying his own rifle. Not a military-issue weapon, but his personal Finnish-made Mosin Nagant M, divided by 28-30, a rifle he'd used for hunting since his youth. The weapon was an extension of his body. He knew its quirks, its personality, the exact trajectory of every bullet it fired. His commanders looked at the short, quiet farmer and wondered what use he could possibly be. They would soon learn. Chapter 2. The Philosophy of the Invisible. The Soviet strategy was simple. Overwhelming force. Columns of soldiers marching through the snow, confident in their numerical superiority. They wore dark uniforms that stood out against the white landscape like ink stains on paper. They moved in large groups, talking, smoking, never imagining that death was watching. Simo Häyhä had a different philosophy. He dressed entirely in white, a snow camouflage suit that rendered him nearly invisible. While other snipers used scopes that could glint in the pale winter sun and fog up in the extreme cold, Simo relied on iron sights. This kept his profile lower, eliminated the telltale reflection, and prevented the scope frost that betrayed so many shooters' positions. But his innovations went deeper into the realm of almost supernatural cunning. He would build his position in the snow itself, creating a small nest where he could lie for hours, completely still. Other men would have died from the cold. Simo simply became part of the winter. Before each session, he would pour water on the snow in front of his position, creating a frozen surface that wouldn't puff up clouds of powder when he fired, betraying his location. And then there was his most ingenious adaptation. He kept snow in his mouth. This wasn't comfort. This was survival. In minus 40-degree temperatures, every exhaled breath creates a visible vapor cloud. For a sniper, such a cloud is a death sentence, a bright arrow pointing to your position. By keeping snow in his mouth, Simo supercooled his breath. The moisture froze before it could form vapor. He could breathe, and the air around him would remain perfectly still, perfectly clear. He would lie in his position for 10, 12, sometimes 20 hours at a stretch, not moving, barely breathing, simply waiting with the patience of a predator that understood its prey completely. Chapter 3. The Killing Ground. The forest near Kala became Simo's hunting ground. Soviet commanders, frustrated by the stubborn Finnish resistance, pushed more and more men toward the Finnish lines. They came in waves, certain that sheer numbers would overwhelm the defenders. What they didn't know was that among the snow-covered trees, a ghost was watching. Simo's first confirmed kills came quickly. A Soviet officer gesturing to his men, directing an assault. One moment he was standing, the next moment he was dead, dropped by a bullet no one heard coming. Confusion rippled through the Soviet ranks. Where had it come from? Then another soldier fell. And another. Panic is a contagious thing. When men start dying from an invisible enemy, when every moment might be your last, and you have no idea where the threat is coming from, courage evaporates like breath in winter air. What made Simo truly terrifying wasn't just his accuracy, though his shooting was preternatural. It was his psychological warfare. He didn't just kill, he created fear. Soviet soldiers began to dread certain areas, certain approaches. They would whisper about the White Death, about the ghost in the snow who could kill you from impossible distances. Some claimed he wasn't human at all. Some said he was a Finnish forest spirit, taking revenge for the invasion. Simo's approach was methodical. He never took unnecessary risks. He never fired more shots than absolutely needed. He would take his shot, then remain absolutely still, watching through his iron sights as other Soviet soldiers rushed to help their fallen comrade. Sometimes he would take a second shot. Sometimes he would simply wait, memorizing faces, positions, patterns. He understood something fundamental. A sniper's greatest weapon isn't the rifle. It's patience. By the end of December 1939, barely a month into the war, Simo Häyhä had over 100 confirmed kills. Soviet commanders were receiving reports of a single sniper decimating entire squads. They couldn't believe it. It seemed impossible. But the bodies told a different story. Chapter 4. The hunter becomes the hunted. The Soviet High Command made a decision. The White Death had to be eliminated. They sent their own counter-snipers, elite marksmen, trained to hunt other snipers. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were specialists, men who'd studied the art of invisible warfare. The Soviets sent teams into the Kala forest with one mission: find Simo Häyhä and kill him. They failed. One by one, the Soviet counter-snipers entered the forest. Some never returned. Others came back with stories of an enemy they couldn't locate, couldn't predict, couldn't defeat. Simo hunted them the same way he hunted everyone else, with patience that bordered on inhuman. He would identify a likely position for an enemy sniper. Then he would wait, not for minutes, but for hours. He would watch through his iron sights, searching for any sign, a slight movement, a reflection, anything that suggested human presence. When he found it, his shots were devastatingly precise. The Soviets tried artillery next. If they couldn't shoot him, they would blow up entire sections of forest. They would bombard areas where they suspected he might be hiding, saturating the landscape with explosives. The earth itself would explode in geysers of frozen soil and shattered trees. Simo survived by never staying in one position too long, by always having multiple prepared positions, by understanding the terrain so completely that he could move like water, always flowing to safety. But he couldn't escape forever. On the 6th of March 1940, exactly 100 days after the war began, Simo Häyhä's luck ran out. Part 2. The Day Death Came Calling. Chapter 5. The 6th of March 1940. The bullet that should have killed him. Dawn broke over the Kala forest, with the pale, weak light that passed for sunshine in the Finnish winter. It was day 100 of the war. Simo Häyhä had been in his position since before sunrise, as he always was. The snow around him was packed and icy from his previous preparations. His rifle, that faithful Mosin Nagant, was steady in his hands. He had no way of knowing that this day would be different from all the others. The Soviet forces had changed their tactics. Frustrated beyond measure by this invisible killer who had claimed over 500 of their men, they had devised a new strategy. They would send soldiers forward as bait, while snipers watched from concealed positions, waiting for Simo to take the shot that would reveal his location. It was a deadly game of chess, and both sides knew it. Simo observed the Soviet positions through his iron sights. Something felt wrong. The soldiers were moving differently, too deliberately, too exposed. His instincts, honed by thousands of hours in these forests, screamed warning, but there were targets. Enemy soldiers threatening his comrades, threatening Finland. He made his decision. He fired. The bullet flew true, as it always did. A Soviet soldier fell. But in that same instant, in that fraction of a second, after the crack of his rifle, another shot rang out. A Soviet sniper, watching through his scope, had been waiting for exactly this moment. He had seen the tiniest flash from Simo's position, the smallest disturbance in the snow. The explosive bullet struck Simo Haiha in the face. Chapter 6. The Unsurvivable Wound. What happened next defies medical explanation. The bullet, an explosive round designed to cause maximum devastation, entered through Simo's left cheek. It tore through his face with catastrophic force, destroying his jaw, shattering teeth, pulverizing bone. The explosive charge detonated inside his mouth. By all logic, by every principle of medicine and battlefield trauma, this wound was instantly fatal. The bullet exited through the right side of his face, taking half his jaw with it. Simo Haiha collapsed into the snow, his face a mask of blood and destroyed tissue. His comrades, hearing the shot and seeing him fall, rushed to his position. What they found horrified them. His face was barely recognizable. Blood poured from the massive wound, staining the white snow crimson. His jaw hung at an impossible angle, more gone than present. Through the gaping wound, they could see inside his mouth, see the destruction the bullet had wrought. He should have been dead. Every soldier who saw him believed he was dead. But Simo Haiha's heart was still beating. His comrades dragged him from his position, expecting at any moment that he would breathe his last. They couldn't stop the bleeding. There was too much damage, too many shattered blood vessels. They wrapped his face as best they could, trying to hold the pieces of his jaw together, trying to keep him alive for just a few more minutes. The journey to the field hospital was a nightmare. Every movement, every bump in the sled they carried him on, threatened to finish what the bullet had started. The medics who received him took one look at the wound and prepared themselves for another death. This man, they thought, this poor soldier, would be dead within the hour. But hours passed, and Simo Haiha continued breathing. Chapter 7. 1 week in the darkness. What followed was one of the most remarkable medical mysteries of the Winter War. Simo slipped into a coma. His body, unable to process the trauma, simply shut down. The doctors at the field hospital did what they could, which wasn't much. This was 1940, in the middle of a brutal war, in conditions that made modern medicine seem like science fiction. They had basic tools, limited supplies, and a patient with a wound that had destroyed half his face. They cleaned the wound as best they could, removing fragments of bone, bits of shattered teeth, pieces of the bullet itself. They tried to reconstruct what remained of his jaw, knowing it was likely a futile effort. All they could really do was wait and see if this impossibly tough farmer would survive the night. He survived that night, and the next, and the next. For 7 days, Simo Haiha lay in a coma while his body fought a battle more intense than any he'd fought in the snow. Infection, the silent killer of battlefield wounds, threatened constantly. In the era before antibiotics were widely available, even small wounds could turn septic and fatal. A wound this massive should have been a death sentence. His body temperature fluctuated wildly. His breathing was labored, rattling through the ruins of his face. The doctors kept him as comfortable as possible and waited for the inevitable. But Simo Haiha had spent his entire life in conditions that killed lesser men. He had endured cold that froze steel, He had remained motionless for 20 hours, at a stretch in temperatures that would induce hypothermia in minutes. His body was a machine calibrated for survival in the harshest environment on Earth. On the 7th day, something miraculous happened. The 13th of March 1940, 1 week after the bullet that should have killed him, Simo Häyhä opened his eyes. Chapter 8. The war ends. The legend begins. The timing was almost poetic. The very same day Simo regained consciousness, the 13th of March 1940, the Winter War officially ended. Finland and the Soviet Union signed an armistice. The impossible had happened. Tiny Finland had forced mighty Soviet Russia to negotiate. The price was steep. Finland lost 11% of its territory, but the nation survived. It remained free. Stalin had predicted the war would last 2 weeks. It had taken 3.5 months and cost the Soviet Union somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 casualties. The world had watched in amazement as Finnish ski troops and snipers like Simo had humiliated one of the world's greatest military powers. When Simo woke, he was told the news. The war was over. Finland endured. He had survived. But what kind of survival was this? His face was ruined. The doctors had done their best, but there was only so much that could be salvaged. His jaw would never work properly again. Speaking would be difficult for the rest of his life. The left side of his face was permanently disfigured, a crater of scar tissue where the bullet had entered. Yet when the doctors examined him, they were astonished by what they found. Against all odds, against all medical probability, the wound was healing. There was no major infection. The bleeding had stopped. His body, that incredible machine forged in the Finnish wilderness, was repairing itself. Simo would need multiple reconstructive surgeries over the coming years. Doctors would attempt to rebuild his jaw, to give him back some semblance of normal function. The procedures were agonizing. Pre-modern reconstructive surgery meant operations without the precision tools and techniques we have today. It meant months of recovery, of pain, of learning to live with a face that would never look the same. But Simo Häyhä faced it all with the same quiet determination he'd shown in the snow. Chapter 9. The Man Behind the Legend. As news of Simo's survival spread, reporters began to seek him out. The world wanted to know, who was this White Death? This ghost who had killed over 500 men? This farmer, who had become the deadliest sniper in history? They expected to find a hardened killer, a man transformed by violence into something cold and remorseless. What they found instead was something far more unsettling: normalcy. Simo Häyhä was soft-spoken, almost shy. He didn't boast about his kills. He didn't revel in his reputation. When asked about the men he'd killed, he would simply say he'd done his duty to Finland. Nothing more, nothing less. "I only did what I was told to do as well as I could," he would say, his reconstructed jaw-making speech labored. This humility somehow made him more frightening, not less. This wasn't a psychopath who enjoyed killing. This was an ordinary man who had been extraordinarily good at something terrible. It suggested that perhaps the capacity for such deadly efficiency existed in more people than anyone wanted to believe. The Soviet Union never forgot him, even decades after the war. Even as the world changed and old enemies became complicated neighbors, Soviet veterans would speak in hushed tones about the White Death. Some claimed he hadn't been real at all, just a propaganda creation. Others insisted he'd been multiple snipers, operating under one name. But Simo knew the truth. 505 confirmed kills, each one a Soviet soldier who had invaded his homeland, each one a threat to Finland's freedom. He had done what needed to be done, in the only way he knew how. The records were clear. The witnesses were numerous. The body count was verified by multiple sources. Simo Häyhä was real, and his achievements, horrifying as they were documented fact. Chapter 10. The question no one could answer. In the years following the war, As Simo slowly recovered and rebuilt his life, one question haunted everyone who learned his story. How? How does a man lie in minus 40-degree cold for 20 hours without dying? How does a man shoot over 500 enemy soldiers in 100 days, 5 kills per day, without scopes, without modern technology? How does a man survive an explosive bullet to the face that should have killed him instantly? The answers, Simo suggested in his rare interviews, were simpler than people wanted to believe. The cold? He'd lived his entire life in it. His body had adapted. Where other men would freeze to death, he simply endured. The shooting? Practice. Thousands upon thousands of hours hunting in these same forests, learning to read the wind, to account for temperature, to become one with his rifle. The survival? Luck. Pure, inexplicable luck. And perhaps a body too stubborn to die. But there was something else, something Simo rarely discussed, but that his fellow soldiers noticed. An absolute calm under pressure. When other men's hands shook from adrenaline, Simo's were steady. When other men's breathing quickened with fear, Simo's remained controlled. He possessed a rare psychological makeup that allowed him to function at peak efficiency in circumstances that would break most people. Modern military psychologists would call it exceptional stress tolerance. His fellow Finns had a simpler term, sisu, an untranslatable Finnish word meaning something like grim determination, the refusal to give up even when all seems lost. Simo Heiha embodied sisu completely. Part 3. The Long Shadow of War. Chapter 11. Return to silence. After the war ended, Simo Heiha did something that shocked those who knew his legend. He disappeared. Not literally, of course. But he withdrew from public life so completely, so deliberately, that he might as well have vanished into the Finnish forests like smoke. The man who had been the most feared sniper in the world wanted nothing more than to return to the quiet life he'd known before the war. He went back to Rautjärvi, or what remained of it. The territory had been ceded to the Soviet Union as part of the peace agreement. The land where he'd grown up, where he'd learned to hunt, where he'd become the man he was, all of it, now belonged to the nation he'd fought against. It was a bitter irony that wasn't lost on him. So Simo settled in Ruokolahti, a small municipality in southeastern Finland. He bought a modest house. He took up farming again, working the land with the same patience and precision he'd shown in everything else. And he tried, as much as possible, to become invisible once more. But you cannot kill 505 men and simply fade away. The legend wouldn't let him. Chapter 12. The Weight of 505 Lives. Reporters would occasionally track him down, seeking interviews about the Winter War, about his experiences, about how it felt to be the deadliest sniper in history. Simo would answer their questions briefly, politely, but with a reluctance that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. When pressed about his feelings regarding the men he'd killed, Simo would give an answer that became famous in Finland. I did what I was told to do, as well as I could. But those who knew him well saw something else beneath that stoic exterior. They saw a man who carried weight, not guilt exactly, but a profound awareness of what he'd done. 505 lives. 505 men who had mothers, perhaps wives, perhaps children. 505 human beings who ceased to exist because of his skill. Simo never celebrated his kills. He never kept trophies. He never bragged. When Finnish military officials wanted to honor him with ceremonies and medals, he attended out of duty but never sought the spotlight. He accepted Finland's highest military decorations, including being promoted from corporal to second lieutenant by Field Marshal Mannerheim himself. But these honors seemed to bring him no joy. One of his fellow veterans once asked him if he had nightmares about the war. Simo's answer was characteristically simple. I did my duty. I sleep fine. But was that true? Or was it the response of a man from a generation that didn't discuss trauma, didn't acknowledge psychological wounds, didn't have the vocabulary for what we now call PTSD? Chapter 13. The Continuation War and the Choice He Made. History wasn't finished with Finland. In 1941, just over a year after the Winter War ended, conflict erupted again. The Continuation War, Finland's attempt to reclaim lost territories with Nazi Germany as a co-belligerent against the Soviet Union, would last until 1944. The Finnish military naturally wanted their greatest sniper back in action. They approached Simo asking him to serve again. His skill was needed. His experience was invaluable. The nation called once more. Simo Haja said no. This decision requires understanding. In Finnish culture, military service is taken seriously. The defense of the nation is considered a sacred duty. For Simo to refuse for the White Death himself to decline was almost unthinkable, but his reasons were compelling. His jaw had never fully healed. Speaking was still difficult. The physical trauma from the explosive bullet had left him with chronic pain and limitations. More than that, though, there seemed to be a deeper reason. One he never fully articulated. Perhaps he felt he'd given enough. Perhaps 505 lives were enough for one man to carry. Perhaps he understood, in a way others didn't, that if he went back he would be effective again, and effective meant more deaths, more weight, more lives ended by his hand. So he stayed home and farmed his land while younger men went to fight. The Continuation War would claim tens of thousands more Finnish lives. The country would survive again, but at terrible cost. Simo worked his fields and remained silent about his choice. If people judged him for not serving, he didn't seem to care. He'd already done more than could reasonably be asked of any human being. Chapter 14. The Unexpected Life. As the decades passed, something unexpected happened. Simo Haja lived. He didn't just survive, he thrived. The man who should have died in 1940, who had survived an unsurvivable wound, kept on living year after year. The 1,950 seconds became the 1,960 seconds. The 1,960 seconds became the 1,970 seconds. The world changed around him. The Cold War, the space race, the rise and fall of empires. And still, Simo Haja worked his farm in Ruokolahti. He developed new interests. Hunting, naturally though, he hunted game now, not men. He became skilled in dog breeding, raising moose hunting dogs with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to stalking Soviet soldiers. He took up sport shooting, competing in rifle and pistol events, despite his facial injuries making it more difficult to aim properly. And here's where Simo's story takes an almost darkly comic turn. The man who'd been shot in the face with an explosive bullet, who'd survived wounds that should have killed him instantly, now lived one of the longest lives of anyone from his generation. He watched his fellow veterans grow old and die. He attended their funerals, one after another, until he was one of the last surviving members of his unit. The young men who'd fought beside him in the snow, most of them were gone by the 1,980 seconds. Simo kept living. Chapter 15. The question he finally answered. In 1998, as Simo approached his 93rd birthday, a reporter managed to secure a rare in-depth interview. By this time, Simo had become a figure of almost mythical status in Finland. New generations had grown up hearing stories about the White Death, about the ghost in the snow, about the farmer who'd held back the Soviet invasion almost single-handedly. The reporter asked the question that everyone wanted answered, but few dared to ask. Do you regret any of the men you killed? Simo was quiet for a long moment. His scarred face, lined with age, was difficult to read. When he finally spoke, his answer was unexpected. I only regret that I had to kill them, he said. They were following orders, just like I was. If they hadn't invaded my country, none of it would have been necessary. It was perhaps the most revealing statement he'd ever made. Not pride, not guilt, just a profound sadness that circumstances had required such violence. He'd done what needed to be done, But that didn't mean he celebrated it. The reporter pressed further. If you could go back, would you do it again? If Finland needed me? Yes, without hesitation. But I would hope Finland would never need me again. This was the essence of Simo Häyhä, a man who would do terrible things if necessary, but who took no pleasure in them. A warrior who longed for peace. A killer who valued life. Chapter 16. The Final Years and the Reckoning. As Simo entered his final years, something shifted in how Finland and the world viewed him. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Russia and Finland had established diplomatic relations. The context of the Winter War seemed different now, viewed through the lens of history rather than immediate threat. Younger generations began to wrestle with Simo's legacy in new ways. Was he a hero? Undoubtedly, he'd defended his nation against invasion. Was he a killer? Undeniably, 505 confirmed deaths. Each one a human life ended. Could he be both? Simo himself seemed untroubled by these debates. He'd long since made peace with what he'd done. He'd been a soldier defending his homeland. The moral clarity of that situation, an unprovoked invasion versus a defensive war, allowed him a certainty that many veterans of more ambiguous conflicts never possessed. He gave occasional interviews, always brief, always focused on the technical aspects of his service rather than the emotional weight. How did he shoot so accurately? Practice. How did he survive the cold? Familiarity. How did he live with what he'd done? Duty. But there was one story from his final years that revealed something deeper. A visiting journalist asked if he'd ever met any Soviet veterans, any survivors from the units he'd fought against. Simo's scarred face showed something that might have been a smile. Once, he said. In the 1990 seconds, at a war history conference. A Russian veteran, about my age. We talked through translators. He told me he'd been at Kala, in the sector where I operated. He said every man in his unit was terrified of the White Death. What did you say to him? I told him I was sorry we'd met under those circumstances, that if our governments hadn't been at war, we might have been friends. We shook hands. That was it. This small moment, a handshake between former enemies, both old men now, both survivors of something terrible, captured something essential about Simo. He'd fought fiercely when needed, but he harbored no hatred. The men he'd killed were never personal enemies. They were simply on the other side of a conflict neither side had truly wanted. Chapter 17. The Legend Lives Forever. Simo Häyhä died on the 1st of April 2002 in a veterans nursing home in Hamina, Finland. He was 96 years old, one of the longest-lived combat veterans in history, and certainly the longest-lived given the severity of his wartime injuries. The man who should have died in 1940 had lived for 62 additional years. His death made international news. Obituaries appeared in newspapers around the world, all recounting the same impossible statistics. 505 confirmed kills in 100 days, the deadliest sniper in history. The White Death. Even in death, his legend seemed larger than life. His funeral was attended by Finnish military officials, fellow veterans, and family. It was a modest affair. Simo would have wanted nothing less. They buried him in Finnish soil, the land he'd fought to defend, the land he'd loved enough to kill for. But here's what makes Simo's story truly remarkable. In the 2 decades since his death, his legend has only grown. Military historians study his tactics. Sniper schools around the world teach his methods. Video games and films have been based on his exploits. Books continue to be written about him. The White Death has become immortal in a way the man himself never sought or wanted. Part 4. The Impossible Man. Chapter 18. The Anatomy of an Anomaly. To understand Simo Häyhä, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. By every measure, he should not have existed. Let's examine the impossibilities. Physical impossibility. A man 152 centimeters tall, barely 5 feet, achieved feats that would challenge soldiers twice his size. In modern military doctrine, height is considered advantageous for snipers' better sightlines. Longer limbs for stability. Simo proved that doctrine wrong. His small stature became an advantage, allowing him to create smaller hides, to move more efficiently through dense forest, to disappear into spaces larger men couldn't use. Physiological impossibility. Lying motionless in minus 40 degrees Celsius temperatures for 20 hours should cause fatal hypothermia. The human body begins shutting down at temperatures far warmer than that. Yet Simo did this repeatedly, day after day, for 100 days. His body had somehow adapted to conditions that would kill most humans within hours. Psychological impossibility. 505 confirmed kills in 100 days means Simo killed, on average, 5 human beings every single day for more than 3 months. The psychological toll of taking even one life haunts most combat veterans for years. How does a human mind process killing 5 people daily and remain functional? Medical impossibility. An explosive bullet through the face, destroying the jaw, creating a wound so massive that medics preparing for death, and yet the victim survives. Not just survives, but lives for 62 more years. Medical literature has few comparable cases. Modern military psychologists have studied Simo's case extensively, trying to understand what made him possible. Their conclusions are both fascinating and unsettling. Dr. David Grossman, a military psychologist who studied combat psychology, identified several traits present in elite warriors. Simo Häyhä possessed all of them, and then some. Exceptional stress tolerance. Most humans, when facing life-threatening danger, experience what's called the stress arousal response. Increased heart rate, rapid breathing, tunnel vision, trembling hands. These responses are evolutionary survival mechanisms, but they're devastating for precision tasks. Like sniping, Simo's heart rate, according to fellow soldiers who observed him, barely changed in combat. His breathing remained controlled. His hands never shook. He possessed what psychologists call parasympathetic dominance, the ability to remain calm when the body screams for panic. This trait is exceptionally rare. Studies suggest only about 2% of combat soldiers possess it naturally. Compartmentalization. The ability to separate the act of killing from emotional response. Simo didn't think of his targets as human beings in the moment. They were simply problems to be solved, threats to be eliminated. This mental distance allowed him to function without the immediate psychological trauma that would incapacitate most people. But here's what's crucial. Simo could turn this compartmentalization on and off. In combat, he was a machine. After combat, he could return to being human. This flexibility is what separated him from psychopaths, who lack empathy entirely. Simo had empathy, he just had exceptional control over when he accessed it. Purpose-driven motivation. Simo wasn't killing for pleasure or glory. He was defending his homeland against invasion. This moral clarity provided psychological protection. Studies of combat veterans show that soldiers fighting defensive wars, protecting their homes, experience significantly less PTSD than those fighting wars of aggression or ambiguous conflicts. Simo slept fine at night because he knew, with absolute certainty, that what he'd done was necessary. Preternatural patience. Perhaps Simo's most remarkable trait was his ability to wait, not for minutes or hours, but for entire days if necessary. To lie motionless in conditions that would drive most people mad with discomfort, simply waiting for the perfect shot. This patience wasn't learned, it was innate. Simo had it as a child, hunting in Finnish forests. The war simply gave him a stage to demonstrate a skill he'd possessed all along.